Yo guys, welcome back to the Uncle Sharma channel, and today's episode actually is an episode for all Serie A fans, not just Inter fans, because today I'm going to be putting together my Serie A team of the decade. Now I'm 26 years old, so right around the start of this decade is when I started watching football a bit more seriously, watching as many matches as I can, starting to understand tactics. This decade might have not been the most memorable decade for neutrals, especially if you're a Serie A fan, especially with Juve dominating the league with 7-8 titles in a row, which has just made it very boring for everyone else. But for me, it's a decade that's close to my heart, because this is what I'll be remembering for most of my life. And obviously as an Inter fan, I'll remember it mainly as a decade of the banter era when Inter were at their lowest points. Before we start, guys, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't. Really helps me out and supports the channel. We also had some interesting teams coming up in this decade. Obviously we had the Atalanta team recently, the fairy tale story. Sassuolo were an exciting team under Di Francesco. The Palermo team, the Pastore, Ilicic, Dybala. Ventura's Torino team with the Immobile and Cerci up front. Udinese team with Di Natale, Alexis Sanchez. So it's been an interesting decade for sure. Obviously it's not been the peak of Italian football, and I've tried to focus this list on the longevity of the player and of course the consistency as well. So it's not really about the name or the reputation of the player, because so Cristiano Ronaldo doesn't make it, because obviously if we looked at all-time players, he's definitely one of the best all-time players that's ever played in the Serie A, but not necessarily for what he's done in the Serie A. And I've also tried to leave out the recency bias, because that's always can be a bit dangerous, just because some things happened recently is at the top of the mind. And I've also tried to leave the nostalgia factor the same way as the recency bias. It can also skew some memories and elevate players above what they actually were. Without further ado, let's get into this Serie A team of the decade. Obviously starting in goal, and this was already such a difficult decision. It was between two players really, Samir Handanovic and Gianluigi Buffon. My initial pick was Gianluigi Buffon. I mean, it's really hard to look past Gianluigi Buffon. Come on guys, he's an absolute legend. Serie A keeper 5 times in this decade alone, 12 times in total, which is a record. And obviously there's a strong argument to say that he's the greatest keeper of all time, which is quite hard to argue that he isn't. However, as I said, this list is about the consistency and longevity in this decade. And if we look past the legend and the name of Buffon, I think we see a man who's dipped in form in the last 2 or 3 years. He left Serie A for a year in Paris, and that year before he left, he was already on the way down, and a lot of Juve fans were calling for Szczesny to take over from him already. And then now he's come back and he's a substitute, and the only reason he plays is because he's put a clause in his contract which allows him to beat Maldini's presence record. And otherwise I don't think he would be getting any playtime in the Serie A. On the other hand, Handanovic obviously started the decade a few notches below Buffon in terms of name and reputation. Of course, he's built his way up slowly from that Udinese team. He won Serie A. He was in the Serie A team of the year in 2011 and 12 with Udinese, and then Inter signed him as the replacement for Julio Cesar. And his peak coincides with the later years of this decade. He's gotten better and better with age, and he has become Inter's captain over the last year, and is probably the Inter player of the decade, which is something that we can discuss in a separate video, who the Inter player of the decade is. But for me, at the moment, thinking off the top of my head, I think Handanovic is probably up there for that. And of course he's been carrying a very mediocre Inter team largely, whereas Buffon has been part of the golden era at Juve at the moment, where they're winning titles on titles. So I think on the balance of things, in the end, I'm picking Samir Handanovic over Gianluigi Buffon, which may be controversial, but I think he deserves it for his consistency and longevity in this decade. Because he's Slovenian, and unluckily he has another world-class player in the Slovenian national team, Oblak, so his name was never able to be elevated to the same level as Buffon, who elevated it with Italy, of course. And obviously Inter in the European competition haven't been good at all, or even hardly present, so that's always hampered him. Let's move on to the defence, and this was probably one of my easier decisions of this list, and that is of course the BBC, Bonucci, Barzagli and Chiellini. It's really hard to look past those three. The BBC trio is just a legendary trio, and will be remembered in the footballing books for years to come. I think that defined this generation of Italian defenders, and I think that they will be the last generation of old school Italian defending, you know, upholding those old standards and being in love with defending. And I think especially Barzagli and Chiellini really embody those old school characteristics of, you know, putting in tough tackles, putting your head where it hurts, battling with the defenders, being rugged, being rough at times. And then Bonucci is perhaps a slightly more modern view of a defender in the middle of the other two, where with his world-class passing, you know, individually probably Bonucci is not the greatest defender, but alongside the other two, he's the perfect ball-playing centre-back in between the other two. And those three, you know, come as a trio, so I had to pick all three of them. You know, as Jose Mourinho said when Man United played Juventus when he was managing them, he said Mr. Bonucci, Mr. Chiellini should give Harvard classes on defending. And that's just the facts. Those three have been, you know, giving masterclasses after masterclasses for the last 8-9 years in the Serie A, and they are the linchpin of why Juve have won so many titles. But, you know, there are honourable mentions in this position as well that were close to, you know, getting into this list. Of course, Acerbi, what he's done at Lazio recently and what he did with Sassuolo before that is, you know, deserves some recognition. He's been a great defender for the Serie A. Koulibaly, especially in the last 2-3 years, he's elevated his game to a really high level. Maybe he's had a dip this season, but the past season he was probably, you know, right up there to being, you know, maybe the best centre-back in world football alongside Van Dijk. Also must mention Stefan de Vrij, who his time at Lazio was also very underrated, but he was hampered with injuries, and now when he's come to Inter the last 2 seasons, he's been one of the best free transfers I can remember. Now moving on to the heart of the team, of course the midfield. Things start to get interesting, but this was another easy pick for me in this, you know, it's an Italian Serie A team, so it has to have a regista, and it doesn't get much better than Andrea Pirlo. You know, if you describe this man as an emoji or as a meme, you know, it has to be the chef kiss, because this guy just oozes class. You know, he's a captain of Aesthetics FC. You know, aesthetically he was always very pleasing to the eye, but he was also super effective, a leader, and, you know, one of the main reasons why the Juve team became what it was. You know, in 2011 when he moved from AC Milan to Juve as a free transfer, he changed the landscape of Italian football. And yeah, things were never the same again after that. With His Majesty Pirlo pulling the strings in the middle of the park, Juve won 4 Scudetti in a row. And Andrea was named Player of the Year in 2012, 2013 and 2014, you know, so showing his consistency at a really high level. But of course there were other good candidates for this role. Obviously Daniele De Rossi, Capitan Futuro of Roma, who took over from Totti after he retired. Also very consistent, but he never quite hit the same heights as Andrea Pirlo in my opinion. He was also hampered by a few injuries here and there. Allan at Napoli, and at Udinese, he was a great servant to both teams, but again, he hasn't hit the same heights. Moving into the right centre mid position, and here, you know, looking for that box-to-box midfielder who can do a bit of everything. And it's hard to look past the ninja Raja Nainggolan, my Indonesian king, my alcoholic king. Probably known more for his off-the-field antics than his on-the-field ones. He was definitely one of the most dynamic and versatile midfielders of the modern Italian era. He was a great servant first at Cagliari, where he broke through, and then at Roma, where he really established himself, and of course at Inter as well. Plus it also helps that he has multiple entries to the goal of the decade contest, because this guy only scores bangers. The Belgian was a mainstay in the Serie A Team of the Year between 2015 and 2018 in every single year. His last season at Roma and at Inter probably were not that good, but he still manages to score really important goals, like the one that sent Inter through to the Champions League against Empoli. And overall, you know, a lot of Inter fans may not think that his transfer was that good, especially because of the transfer fee and the fact that Zaniolo went the other way. But for me, I still think that was a decent transfer, because at the end of the day, he did make the difference for this team. There was a lot of competition for this position as well, obviously from Juve mainly. Arturo Vidal, Claudio Marchisio, Paul Pogba, you know, any of those three could have made it into the list, because those three really defined an era in the Italian football. You know, especially Vidal, he was a dominating midfielder, but then Pogba really exploded under Conte and Allegri afterwards. He was really unplayable at times. He was bullying other midfielders. Marchisio, of course, also he was mainstay in the Juve team, very versatile, but hampered with injuries and maybe discarded towards the end, so which kind of tarnished his legacy. And Vidal and Pogba, obviously, it would have been nice to have those two, stay in the Serie A for a bit longer, but they were only here for 3 or 4 years, so that's why Nainggolan for me goes ahead of them. The other midfield role was a close battle as well, and this one I went for Marek Hamsik, the legendary former Napoli captain, Slovakian legend. Between 2010 and today, there's no midfielder in the Serie A who scored more goals, 74, or racked up as many assists, 69. That just says everything about Hamsik. And he was also named in the Serie A Team of the Year 3 times in 2012, 2016 and 2017. And plus his leadership quality and loyalty to Napoli, really give him the edge to who my other candidate was, which is Pjanic. Took a while to get used to Italian football when he first moved to Roma from Lyon, but then he really took the game by the scruff of the neck with his technical ability and his free kicks, and then obviously went on to Juve and started winning titles and moved into a more of a regista role. But then he's also known to be a very dirty player, let's say, which leaves a bad taste in my mouth as an Inter fan. But there's no bias in this list. I just think that Hamsik's leadership and the consistency of the last decade gives him a slight edge over Pjanic. I've gone for a 3-5-2 type Conte formation, so this formation technically has to have some wing backs, but my next pick is in the wing back position, but it's not really a wing back. It doesn't really matter. It's not a real team. It's not going to really go out there and play. And my next pick is, one of the most dynamic and one of the most entertaining players of the last decade, and that is Alejandro Gomez, also known as Papu Gomez. I actually initially picked Cristian Maggio for this role, but then I thought about it and I wasn't convinced, because after the 2014-15 season he didn't really do much. He kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. And Lichtsteiner was also a second thought, although he is probably one of the most annoying players as an Inter fan. His consistency was top notch, but he never really reached any particular highs as an individual, although he was part of a great Juve team. But Papu Gomez, he's been lighting up the Serie A for many years now. Been lighting it up since his day as Catania, a much smaller team that was relegation battling when he was initially there. He left Italy for a year to Ukraine and then came back. And then, his first year back was okay at Atalanta, but then afterwards, under Gasperini, he's really been the reason why this Atalanta team has, scaled heights that no one ever imagined, and he has been really the catalyst to that with his goals scored and assists, and his dribbling ability, his vision, and his off the field. He's become a social media phenomenon, and he's just an all-round good guy. And I think he deserves to be in the team of the decade for sure. On the other side, as a left wing back, I was thinking of Alexandro, who also, has been part of great Juve teams. That's why I've gone for Senad Lulic as my left wing back, Lazio captain, and the Lazio captain who just a few days ago beat Juve, scored the 2-1 leading goal and lifted the trophy just like he did in 2013 when he lifted the Coppa Italia. Lifting 2 trophies as a Lazio player in this decade just elevates him to the next level, because his importance to the Lazio team is levels higher than what Alexandro's importance is to the Juventus team. Lulic, Bosnian, was signed from Young Boys in 2011 for just over 3 million euros, which will go down as one of the best transfers in Lazio's history. He's versatile. He's played in pretty much every position on the field. He's 2-footed, and he'll go down as an immortal now because of those trophies that he's won. Other good mentions, of course, go to the likes of Kolarov for Roma, and Asamoah as well, who at Juve was an important player, and when he came to Inter he was also a very consistent and stable player. And now we get to the top of the team, the goal scorers, and we've had some really interesting players over the last decade in the Serie A. You might say it's not really been the golden decade in terms of individual talent, but we've had some pretty good strikers up there when you think about it. But the one player that I had no doubts about picking is Antonio Di Natale. This guy, he started this decade in his 30s, so he was already past his peak age in theory, but this guy has scored more Serie A goals in this decade than any other player. with a staggering 125 goals in this decade. He did do most of his damage in the first half of the decade, but what damage he did. The small, tiny, diminutive striker won the Capocannoniere Award twice, even though he was playing for a small team like Udinese. You know, he was really carrying a very average or below average team for a long time, and he continues scoring well into his mid-30s. Just for that, I think he deserves to have that spot in this team. Again, like Nangolan, this guy has got a reel of goals that would be a contender for goal of the decade, because this guy's technique and class was just out of this world. And finally, the final striker position in the 3-5-2. This was probably my hardest decision because there's so much competition for this role. We have the likes of Dries Mertens, we have Edinson Cavani, we had Edin Dzeko, we even have Josip Ilicic. But the one I was really debating here was between Mauro Icardi and Gonzalo Higuain. Two Argentine gunmen, two players that know how to put the ball in the back of the net. You know, of course, Inter fans might have a bad taste left with Icardi, with the way things have ended with him and the club recently, but there's no denying that the boy pretty much carried the club on his back over the last 6-7 years, becoming the 8th all-time top scorer, beating Christian Vieri with 123 goals, and also being named Serie A Player of the Year once as well. On the other hand, Higuain, the way he came to Napoli, you know, really changed things for Napoli, because he was the first big marquee signing under Aurelio De Laurentiis, coming from Real Madrid for big money, and then carrying that pretty average Napoli team, scoring 36 goals in one season, guys. 36. I don't think that will ever be matched. That was a crazy season. And then also led Napoli to their first trophy, which you know, Icardi wasn't able to do, and then obviously moved on to Juve to win more Scudetti, never reaching obviously those same highs that he did at Napoli, where the team was perhaps built around him, but you know, still remaining consistent and scoring goals. Obviously he had that dip last season when he moved to Milan and then went to Chelsea, but you know, he's back to a decent form again this season, and I think just because of that he edges the likes of Dzeko and Icardi, because I mean, that one season is really, you know, almost unbeatable, and then he's continued with the high goal scoring seasons all the way through. And finally, for coach of the decade, this was again, you know, obviously Juve dominating everything, so it had to be one of the Juve coaches, because Antonio Conte, when he came in 2011, you know, he changed the game with his 3-defender formation, the intensity of his team. That was the catalyst for the dominance after all of these years. But then Allegri carried that on with even more dominance. But I feel like Allegri, even though he, you know, continued that dominance domestically, his better work was done in Europe, where, you know, Juve reached 2 Champions League finals. So I think for coach of the decade has to go to Antonio Conte for his work at Juve. Those consecutive titles, you know, amazing work, because that team came from a 7th place finish the season before, so let's not forget that. Proved that Juve team to no end, and the same that he's doing to Inter right now, that we finished 4th last season and now we're challenging for the Scudetto with very average players mostly around in the team. He's able to elevate average players to the next level, and that is something that I don't think many coaches around the world can do. And for that reason, Antonio Conte is my manager of the decade, and he'll be managing my team of the decade. Yeah, that was my team of the decade, guys. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are. Who do you agree with? Who do you disagree with? Is there any ones that I got completely wrong? Or should there be more Inter players, or should there be none? Was I biased with the Handanovic in there? Looking forward to reading your comments down below, seeing maybe what abuse I will receive for some controversial decision I made. Look forward to reading those, and make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao!